Whispers of History.
The desert is a place of silence. In 1931, when the winds swept across the barren flats of Southern California, they carried with them not just sand, but whispers. Rumors of a small group of people who believed they had been chosen to witness the end of the world. In the middle of a withered farmhouse, lit by the weak glow of oil lamps, men and women gathered in anxious stillness. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide, fixed on the darkened sky outside. They were waiting, convinced that tonight the heavens would open. Fire would rain down, and everything they knew would be erased. At the center of this gathering stood their leader, a man who called himself Brother Emmanuel. Thin, sharp-eyed, and unyielding in presence, he had convinced his followers that divine visions had singled him out as a prophet. Emmanuel's voice, calm yet commanding, told them that their suffering would soon end, that in the ruins of the old world, a new kingdom would rise, and only the faithful would be spared. He spoke of angels, of burning cities, of oceans boiling away into steam. And those around him, desperate from years of economic despair, clung to his words like drowning men clinging to driftwood. The followers were not strangers to pain. The Great Depression had stripped many of them of their homes, their savings, their very sense of security. Banks had closed, jobs had vanished, and food was scarce. Hunger gnawed at their children. Fear pressed down on their lives like a weight that would never lift. They looked at Emmanuel and saw a man who promised not just survival but purpose. It was easier to believe the end was coming than to believe that tomorrow would bring the same emptiness they had endured yesterday. Neighbors in nearby towns whispered about the cult with equal parts, fascination and unease. By day, the group could be seen moving in ritualistic patterns. Women in faded white dresses walking circles around the farmhouse, men laboring in silence to clear the dry land that could not be tamed. By night, strange songs rose into the desert air, low, mournful hymns that sometimes twisted into screams before cutting off abruptly. Children were rarely seen, and when they were, their eyes held the same faraway look as their parents, as if they too were already living in another world. Lawmen rode out more than once to see what was happening. They found nothing illegal. A handful of poor families, praying in their own way, living quietly on the edge of the desert. Strange perhaps, but harmless. Yet those who came too close said something about the place felt wrong. The silence was too heavy, the stares too sharp, the atmosphere thick with anticipation of something that could not be named. Inside the farmhouse, anticipation was eating at the followers. For months they had waited for the promised day, the night of fire. They had given up their possessions, abandoned their relatives, and staked everything on Brother Emmanuel's prophecy. And as the appointed hour drew near, tension twisted in the room. What if nothing happened? What if dawn came and the earth remained unbroken? To question Emmanuel was dangerous. His grip on the group was firm, built on both devotion and fear. He warned that those who doubted would be cast aside, consumed with the rest of the sinful world. And so they silenced their doubts, folding them into the shadows, letting fear hold their tongues. Still, in the flicker of the oil lamps, some faces betrayed unease. Mothers clutched their children closer. Husbands looked to their wives with the quiet question no one dared ask aloud. The desert outside pressed in on them. Coyotes howled in the distance, their cries carrying on the wind like omens. The ticking of an old clock marked each passing second with a sharpness that grew unbearable. Shadows on the wall stretched and bent as the lamps burned low. Every sound, every creak of the old farmhouse boards seemed magnified. This was not the frenzy of fire and brimstone revival meetings. This was quieter, stranger, a gathering of people paralyzed by the fear of being left behind, waiting not for life, but for obliteration. And in the middle of it stood a man whose face betrayed something darker than faith. Brother Emmanuel was no longer only a prophet. He was a man who had tied his entire existence to a vision. If that vision failed, he would collapse with it. What happened in that room that night is remembered not as a miracle but as a haunting. Some said the group descended into hysteria when the world refused to end. Others whispered that darker rituals were performed in the hours after midnight, desperate acts to appease the silence of the heavens. The truth is tangled in rumor, but what is certain is that when dawn finally came, the farmhouse was changed. And so were the people inside. This is not simply the story of a failed prophecy. It is the story of what happens when despair consumes a community. when suffering makes even the most rational minds vulnerable to promises of salvation. It is a story about how the human need for hope can be twisted into something terrible, something that leads ordinary men and women to wait in silence for the end of the world. And as we begin to uncover this tale, we must ask ourselves, what is more frightening, the idea that the world could end in fire, or the possibility that people might destroy themselves long before it does? To understand how a small group of men and women could gather in the California desert in 1931, convinced they would witness the destruction of the world, we must step back and look at the landscape of American life during that time. History is never only about the event itself, it is about the soil in which those events take root. And in this case, the soil was dry, fractured, and heavy with despair. The year 1931 fell deep within the Great Depression. Wall Street had collapsed in 1929, but the aftershocks reverberated for years. Across America, banks failed, factories closed, and unemployment soared to levels the nation had never seen. Entire families were evicted from their homes, farmers watched their crops wither without buyers, and bread lines stretched down city streets. In rural communities, the crisis was even sharper. Those who had once prided themselves on self-reliance now found themselves bartering for food, selling heirlooms, or leaving their farms in search of survival. California in particular was a land of paradox during these years. For some, it represented hope, a place of sunshine, fertile soil, and possibility. Thousands of families from the Dust Bowl states would soon make their way west, chasing the promise of agricultural work in the valleys. But for those already there, California was not always kind. Wealth was concentrated in the hands of a few, while laborers often toiled in near poverty. Many rural families lived in isolation, with little connection to towns or cities, relying instead on local churches, gossip, and the occasional newspaper for a sense of the wider world. This was fertile ground for new religious movements. The 19th and early 20th centuries had already seen the rise of charismatic leaders who claimed divine visions. Some had built thriving congregations, others fizzled into obscurity. What they all shared was an ability to tap into the anxieties of their time. In periods of economic growth, people looked to religion for comfort or tradition. But in periods of crisis, people looked to it for answers that promised certainty in an uncertain world. The United States had a long tradition of apocalyptic thought. Since colonial times, preachers had warned that the end was near, citing wars, earthquakes, or comets as proof. The so-called Millerites of the 1840s had famously sold their belongings and donned white robes, waiting on hillsides for Christ's return on a specific date. When nothing happened, many abandoned the faith, but some clung tighter, forming the foundation of later religious movements. By the 20th century, the pattern had repeated many times. When the world felt unstable, end times prophecy always seemed to find an audience. By 1931, instability was everywhere. Not only were economic conditions dire, but the pace of change in American life had unsettled many. The modern world was emerging, cars, radios, electricity spreading into rural areas. For older generations, the America they knew seemed to be slipping away. Religious leaders capitalized on this unease. Some emphasized traditional morality, warning that the Depression was God's punishment for sin. Others promised an imminent apocalypse that would wipe away corruption and usher in a purified world. California itself had a particular reputation for strange and eccentric religious sects. The wide open spaces, the mix of cultures, and the distance from traditional centers of power created an environment where unconventional beliefs could thrive. By the 1920s and 1930s, Los Angeles was already notorious for its spiritual entrepreneurs, individuals who offered everything from healing seances to cosmic philosophies. Some claimed communication with extraterrestrials, others claimed they could speak with the dead. Against this backdrop, Brother Emmanuel's message did not seem wholly out of place. Socially, his followers were not unusual people. They were, by and large, those left behind by the collapse of the economy. They were poor farmers whose land no longer produced enough to sustain them. They were shopkeepers whose businesses had gone under. They were widows and single mothers with no safety net. Many were deeply religious already, raised in Protestant traditions that emphasized personal salvation and divine judgment. When Emmanuel came along with his visions of an ending world, they were primed to believe. There was also the cultural fascination with prophecy itself. Newspapers of the era often published sensational stories about doomsday predictions. Astrological columns gained popularity, promising insight into troubled times. In the early 1930s, even mainstream magazines discussed the possibility of social collapse. Science added its own unease. Discoveries about the atom, speculation about space, and reports of natural disasters fed the sense that the world was fragile. Against this anxious backdrop, the claims of a local prophet did not sound entirely implausible. Another factor was isolation. In rural California, communities were often cut off from larger society. Without constant access to newspapers or radios, rumor traveled faster than fact. A charismatic leader could shape the worldview of his immediate followers with little challenge. Outsiders might laugh, but for those inside the circle, Emmanuel's voice was the loudest, and sometimes the only authority they heard. The broader American culture also played a role. The Depression was not only an economic collapse, but a psychological one. Faith in institutions, banks, government, industry was shaken. If the most powerful men in the country could not prevent disaster, why not look instead to divine visions? When your savings disappeared overnight, when your neighbor's farm was repossessed, when you watched your children go hungry, the notion that God would soon intervene did not seem foolish. It seemed merciful. And so in the dusty corners of California, Brother Emmanuel's cult grew. He was not the only prophet of doom at the time, but his following was tight-knit, bound not by numbers, but by intensity. These were not casual believers. They were people who had given up everything, who had staked their lives and futures on the promise of salvation. Their faith was both their anchor and their cage. Looking back, it is easy to dismiss them as irrational. But to do so is to ignore the weight of their circumstances. Imagine a world where every day feels like another step into ruin, where each newspaper headline brings only more despair. Imagine hearing a voice tell you that all of this suffering will soon end, that you are not forgotten, that you have been chosen. For many, that promise would be irresistible. This was the world of 1931, a world fraying at the edges, where hope and fear tangled together. A world where apocalyptic visions could spread like wildfire, not because people wanted destruction, but because they wanted deliverance. It was in this fragile soil that the cult took root, growing from the cracks of a broken society into something that would soon reveal its darkest face. And as the night of prophecy drew closer, the question hung heavier than the desert heat. What happens to people who have bet everything on the end of the world when the world stubbornly refuses to end? The farmhouse stood alone against the barren sweep of the desert, its wooden boards warped and cracked by years of heat. On the night the prophecy was expected to be fulfilled, the group huddled inside, pressed together in uneasy silence. Candles flickered, throwing long, jagged shadows across the walls. The air was stifling, heavy with the scent of sweat and kerosene, as though the atmosphere itself was closing in. Brother Emmanuel stood before them, his voice low but unshakable, reciting words he claimed had been given to him in visions. He told them the time was near, that the hour of fire had come. At first, there was only waiting. The followers held each other's hands, eyes fixed on the ceiling or the sky beyond the small window. Children whimpered, hushed quickly by their mothers. The clock on the wall ticked louder with every passing moment. When the appointed hour arrived, a murmur rippled through the group. They braced themselves for thunder, for fire, for the ground to tremble beneath their feet. Yet nothing came. The silence deepened, so heavy it pressed against their chests. Brother Emmanuel closed his eyes and lifted his hands, insisting the delay was a test of faith. But the silence dragged on. Whispers began in the back of the room. A man shifted uneasily, asking if perhaps they had misread the signs. Emmanuel's face hardened, his eyes flashing with a sharpness that silenced them again. He declared that the prophecy was still true, that God's clock was not the same as man's, and that any who doubted would be cast into damnation. His words quelled them for the moment, but doubt had entered the room like a draft under the door. As the night stretched into early morning, tension began to twist the followers' nerves. A woman fainted, overcome by the heat and fear. Others tried to rouse her, dabbing her forehead with damp cloths, while Emmanuel proclaimed that her collapse was a sign. The angels were already at work. Some clung to that interpretation, nodding fervently, while others looked at her with growing unease. The longer nothing happened, the more the strain grew unbearable. In the following days, Emmanuel doubled down on his teachings. He insisted the final hour had merely been delayed and that greater devotion was required to bring about the divine event. He began ordering longer rituals. Followers stood in circles outside beneath the burning sun, chanting prayers until their voices cracked and their lips bled. Children were made to fast, their small faces hollow with hunger. At night, the group sang strange hymns, their voices echoing eerily into the desert. The neighbors who lived miles away claimed they could hear the cries carried on the wind, a sound that unsettled them even within the safety of their own homes. Weeks passed, and the strain deepened. Emmanuel grew harsher. He warned his followers that doubt among them was poisoning the prophecy. He singled out individuals, accusing them of weakness, demanding public confessions. Those who wavered were forced to kneel while the others shouted prayers over them, sometimes until they collapsed in exhaustion. Slowly, the group became fractured, but still they clung to Emmanuel's words, too far gone to walk away, too afraid of being left behind when the fire finally came. One night, as another predicted hour approached, Emmanuel commanded that the farmhouse be sealed. Windows were shuttered, doors barred, candles extinguished until only the faintest light remained. The followers sat in suffocating darkness, their breaths audible, their nerves fraying. A scream pierced the silence. A young boy, terrified, his voice high and panicked. His mother tried to calm him, but Emmanuel's sharp rebuke silenced them all. He declared that fear was the last barrier, and that only through silence could they be saved. For hours they sat in darkness, hearts pounding, until dawn light seeped through the cracks. The world outside remained unchanged. The pressure of repeated disappointment began to twist the group further. Emmanuel shifted his teachings, telling them that God's wrath was being withheld only because of their prayers, that their suffering was holding back the end of the world. Some found pride in this, believing themselves chosen saviors. Others felt the crushing weight of responsibility, convinced that any lapse in devotion would doom humanity. Sleepless nights followed, prayers whispered into the endless dark, every moment thick with paranoia. There were reports, quiet, whispered later by those who escaped, that Emmanuel began speaking of blood. He claimed the heavens required sacrifice, not merely words. A lamb was slaughtered one evening, its cries ringing out before being silenced, its blood smeared on the threshold of the farmhouse. To the outsiders who later recalled the stench, it was clear something had shifted. Ritual had given way to desperation. The boundaries between devotion and horror were dissolving. As the months passed, the group grew gaunt and hollow. Food was scarce, as Emmanuel commanded fasts to purify their bodies. Mothers gave the last scraps to their children, who themselves wasted away. Yet the devotion did not break. For many, leaving was unthinkable. They had burned bridges with family, sold possessions, and convinced themselves there was no life outside the cult. Others who thought of fleeing were kept in check by fear of Emmanuel, fear of damnation, fear of being alone in the desert with nothing. By late 1931, whispers spread in nearby towns. Travelers spoke of strange figures wandering the desert at night, their eyes wild, muttering about fire from the sky. Some said they saw the followers digging into the earth, building shallow pits that looked like graves. The sheriff made another visit, but the group appeared calm, offering polite words and little else. With no crime to arrest them for, the lawmen left, though they admitted later they felt the weight of something terrible just beyond their grasp. Inside, the situation deteriorated. A man collapsed during one of the endless prayer vigils, his body trembling with fever. Instead of sending for a doctor, Emmanuel declared his sickness a test. The man was left on the floor, the group praying over him as he slipped in and out of consciousness. His moans filled the farmhouse for hours, then faded into silence. Emmanuel claimed his soul had been taken, proof of the prophecy's nearness. No one dared question. The farmhouse became a place outside of time. Days bled into nights, rituals into delirium. Followers spoke in hushed tones of visions, of seeing fire in their dreams, of hearing whispers in the dark. Some began to lose touch with reality, unable to distinguish Emmanuel's words from their own fractured thoughts. Yet through it all, the prophet stood unyielding, his voice the only steady rhythm in their unraveling world. What had begun as a promise of salvation had turned into a nightmare of waiting, of fear, of bodies wasting away in the desert heat. The end of the world had not arrived, but something within the cult had ended nonetheless. The people they once were, the farmers, mothers, children of California, were gone. What remained were shadows, bound together in silence, waiting still for the fire that never came. News of the strange cult spread slowly, like a whispered rumor carried on the desert wind. At first, few beyond the small farming communities of California paid attention. In 1931, the world was already heavy with crisis. The Great Depression left families starving, men desperate for work, and entire towns stripped of hope. Against that backdrop, the tale of a group of people hiding in a farmhouse, waiting for the fire of God, seemed almost like an exaggeration. The sort of story neighbors told in hushed voices, more to frighten than to inform. Yet as weeks stretched into months, curiosity grew into alarm. Families of those who had joined the cult felt the sting of absence most sharply. Letters stopped arriving. Visits ceased. A mother in Fresno wrote again and again to her daughter, begging her to come home, only to receive silence. Brothers searched the deserts on horseback, riding past dry gullies and abandoned shacks, hoping to catch a glimpse of their kin. Each time they returned with nothing but dust clinging to their boots. The missing became ghosts while still alive. Doctors who heard stories of the group were quick to issue their judgments. They described the followers as victims of hysteria, swept up by the charisma of a single man. The term religious mania appeared often in medical journals of the time, applied to cases where belief overpowered reason. Some physicians argued that starvation and exhaustion from long rituals could themselves induce hallucinations, creating the very visions that reinforced Emmanuel's grip. Others spoke of mass psychosis, a phenomenon where fear and hope spread like contagion, binding people tighter than any physical chain. Pastors in the surrounding towns offered different explanations. In their sermons, some condemned Emmanuel outright, calling him a false prophet leading souls astray. They warned their congregations to avoid the cult, to shield their children from its poisonous teachings. Yet others saw in the story a grim reflection of the hunger that lingered in society at large. They preached that the cult was a symptom of despair, proof that people, stripped of jobs and bread, would cling to any promise of meaning, even one wrapped in doom. Neighbors, though, had the most vivid tales. Farmers claimed to hear the singing late at night, the eerie cadence drifting over the dry land. A rancher swore he once saw a line of people walking across the desert at midnight, their figures pale in the moonlight, moving as though in a trance. When he called out, they did not answer, only continued their march until the dark swallowed them. Another woman who lived miles away reported seeing strange fires on the horizon, though whether they were campfires, lanterns, or something else she could not say. The uncertainty fed the unease, and soon the cult was no longer just a curiosity but a specter that haunted the region. Local newspapers, desperate for stories that could sell in grim economic times, seized upon the rumors. Headlines hinted at doom. Prophets of fire await the sky's wrath, or end of world predicted in California desert. Reporters, however, often could not get close enough to verify the tales. When they approached the farmhouse, the followers refused them entry. Some journalists embellished what little they saw, describing gaunt faces at windows, shadows moving inside, the smell of blood on the wind. These stories only deepened the legend, turning the cult into both spectacle and warning. Psychologists of the era, though still developing their field, used the cult as a case study in human behavior under strain. They noted how Emmanuel positioned himself as both savior and judge, offering absolute certainty in a time when nothing else seemed secure. In the chaos of the Depression, where banks collapsed and families lost homes overnight, his promises, even of destruction, gave a strange form of stability. It was not happiness he offered, but clarity, and to many that was enough. Law enforcement found themselves in a difficult position. The sheriff's department received complaints from locals, but without clear evidence of crime, there was little they could do. The United States, after all, was founded on freedom of religion, and as long as no bodies appeared and no laws were broken, the cult was beyond reach. Still, sheriffs made patrols, sometimes approaching the farmhouse, knocking on the door, only to be met with silence or polite refusal. Inside, the followers hid behind drawn curtains, hearts pounding, afraid that contact with the outside world would unravel everything they had built. To the wider American public, the story eventually became one of fascination tinged with mockery. Cartoons appeared in certain papers, depicting wild-eyed prophets waving signs that read, "The end is near." Radio commentators chuckled about those folks in the desert, painting them as foolish dreamers. But beneath the laughter, there was unease. For every person who mocked, another secretly wondered what drove ordinary men and women to abandon their lives and wait in silence for the sky to fall. The cultural climate of the 1930s magnified this reaction. America was searching for explanations, for meaning behind its suffering. Dust storms ravaged the plains, breadlines stretched for blocks, and political upheaval brewed in Europe. Against this backdrop, the cult seemed both absurd and strangely prophetic. They were not alone in fearing an end. They had simply given their fear a name, a leader, and a ritual. Their extremity reflected the quiet desperation present in countless homes, where families prayed for rescue, even if they never voiced it aloud. In later years, survivors who escaped told their stories. Some described the crushing disappointment of nights spent waiting in darkness for a sky that never opened. Others spoke of the shame they felt, returning to families who could not understand why they had left in the first place. A few defended Emmanuel even after his downfall, insisting that he had been right, only mistimed. These testimonies appeared in oral histories and interviews decades later, painting a picture of people who were not monsters or fools, but deeply human, caught in a web of belief and despair. The cult's presence left a scar on the region. Families divided, friendships shattered, land abandoned. To some, it was a cautionary tale of how desperation can lead to destruction. To others, it remained a mystery, a reminder of the thin line between faith and delusion. In the end, the reaction of society was not simple. It was a mixture of fear, ridicule, sympathy, and warning, a collective attempt to understand what had happened in that lonely farmhouse, and perhaps to prevent it from happening again. The desert night was cold, the air so still it felt as if the world itself held its breath. Inside the farmhouse, the cult gathered in silence. The kerosene lamps flickered against the walls, casting long, trembling shadows that seemed to move on their own. Emmanuel stood before them, his eyes dark with conviction, his voice low yet commanding. He declared that the signs were here at last, that the world's final hour had arrived. The followers knelt, some clutching their children, others gripping the hands of those they loved. They had sold their belongings, abandoned their homes, and left behind everything they had once known for this night. Fear rippled through them, but so did hope. The promise of being saved, of transcending the misery of hunger and hardship, was powerful enough to keep them bound together in that room. A storm had been building on the horizon all day, strange and out of place for that season. Clouds blackened the sky, covering the moon until only flashes of distant lightning broke through. Each strike illuminated the desert with a pale, ghostly light, and each time the followers gasped, convinced it was the sign they had been waiting for. Emmanuel raised his arms and told them the fire of God was descending. They trembled, believing the earth itself was preparing to split open beneath them. Then came the first sound, a crash so loud it shook the walls. It was thunder, rolling across the desert, but to those inside the farmhouse, it was the trumpet of the apocalypse. Several followers screamed, clutching each other, while others began to chant in unison. Their voices were uneven, a desperate hymn meant to drown out their fear. Children cried, mothers shushed them, and still Emmanuel commanded their attention, urging them to hold fast, to prepare for salvation. Hours passed in this fevered state. The storm raged, battering the windows, rattling the doors, while inside the people prayed louder, screamed harder, wept deeper. At one point, a bolt of lightning struck so close that the sound was like a cannon. The farmhouse shook, dust fell from the ceiling, and a woman collapsed, convinced that the ground was splitting beneath her. Emmanuel declared it was the sign, the gates of heaven opening. He demanded they surrender fully, casting away doubt. Some obeyed with a frightening devotion. A man tore off his shirt, raised his arms, and shouted that he was ready to be consumed by holy fire. Another began to convulse, shaking violently, either from ecstasy or terror, until he fell to the floor. His wife knelt beside him, sobbing, whispering prayers in his ear. The air was heavy with the smell of sweat, kerosene, and fear, as if the walls themselves absorbed the despair and fed it back into the room. But others faltered. A young woman near the back began to sob uncontrollably, whispering that she wanted to leave, that she couldn't stay another moment. Her brother gripped her arm, telling her to endure, but her voice grew louder, pleading, breaking the tense unity of the gathering. Emmanuel's gaze locked on her, sharp and furious. In a booming voice, he declared her a traitor, an agent of doubt sent to weaken their faith. His words pierced the silence like a knife, and the woman shrank back, trembling. Lightning struck again, closer this time, shattering a tree outside. The sound roared through the farmhouse, and in the chaos, someone screamed that the sky was on fire. The children wailed, their cries mixing with the chants of the adults. Fear became hysteria. Several rushed toward the windows, pressing their faces against the glass, desperate to see the promised destruction. Others fell to the floor, curling into themselves, praying incoherently, and then suddenly there was silence. The storm rolled onward, its fury fading into the distance. The thunder grew weaker, the lightning less frequent. One by one, the voices in the farmhouse died down, until only the sound of ragged breathing remained. The promised end had not come. The earth had not split. The fire had not fallen. For the first time, Emmanuel faltered. His voice, once thunderous, trembled as he insisted that the test was not yet complete, that God had delayed only to measure their faith. He urged them to remain steadfast, to wait longer. But the spell had broken. The silence of the storm's retreat pressed upon the room like a weight, and doubt seeped in through the cracks of their devotion. Whispers rose among them. Some demanded to know why nothing had happened. Others began to sob, not from fear this time, but from the crushing disappointment of a hope betrayed. A man shouted that they had given everything, that he had nothing left, and his voice cracked as he demanded answers. Emmanuel tried to calm them, but the authority in his tone was gone. His words sounded fragile, desperate, like a man clinging to the edge of a cliff. In the corner, one follower collapsed, overwhelmed by exhaustion and despair. Another began to laugh, a hollow, broken sound that chilled the others to silence. The laughter grew louder, filling the room with madness, until he was dragged down by others, restrained from unraveling further. The fragile unity of the cult had shattered. Fear turned to anger, and devotion curdled into doubt. As dawn broke, pale light creeping across the desert, the farmhouse stood in eerie stillness. The followers sat slumped against the walls, eyes hollow, bodies trembling. They had spent the night waiting for fire and brimstone, only to be met with silence. Emmanuel still spoke of patience, of tests, of divine mysteries, but few listened. The night that was supposed to bring salvation had instead left them in ruins. Their faith cracked beyond repair. The climactic storm that should have ended the world instead ended something far more fragile, their belief. And in that fragile silence of morning, with dust motes drifting through beams of sunlight, they realized that the apocalypse had not consumed the earth, it had consumed them. When the farmhouse finally emptied, the desert reclaimed its silence. The followers left in small groups, some wandering aimlessly down the dusty roads, others returning to families who barely recognized them. Their faces carried the weight of sleepless nights, of hope stretched until it broke, of faith turned brittle and sharp. Emmanuel himself was said to have remained inside for days, curtains drawn, refusing to speak to anyone. To his closest followers, he insisted that the prophecy had not failed. It had only shifted, delayed by forces beyond mortal comprehension. But to those who had seen the storm pass and the sun rise unbroken, the illusion was gone. Neighbors who had long watched from afar spoke of the sudden emptiness that followed. The farmhouse that once rang with chanting now sat abandoned, its windows dark. Some claimed they saw Emmanuel leave one night, walking into the desert without a lantern, never to return. Others swore they caught glimpses of him in nearby towns, reduced to a ghost of himself, muttering about signs no one else could see. Whether he vanished into the sands or lived on in obscurity, history offers no clear answer. For the families of those who joined, the scars ran deep. Some welcomed their loved ones back, but could not understand the choices they had made. Conversations at dinner tables turned into arguments, forgiveness mixed with shame. In certain households, the subject was never spoken of again, as if silence could erase what had transpired. Yet silence only deepened the wound, leaving generations to wonder why their relatives had once turned from the world in search of an ending that never came. Scholars, writing decades later, pointed to the cult as a symptom of its time. The Great Depression had stripped people of stability, and into that void rushed every form of desperation. Prophets like Emmanuel thrived not because their visions were clear, but because they offered a simple truth. The pain would end soon. Historians argued that the cult was not an isolated madness, but part of a larger story, where faith, despair, and poverty collided to create fragile movements doomed to collapse. In that way, the farmhouse was less a sanctuary than a mirror, reflecting the hunger and uncertainty of an entire era. Yet mystery lingers, and perhaps always will. Some survivors carried fragments of their faith with them, insisting even years later that Emmanuel had been right. They believed the world truly would end, not in 1931, but someday soon. In quiet interviews recorded long after the fact, their voices shook as they described dreams of fire, visions of angels, whispers in the night. For them, the night of the storm was not a failure. It was a rehearsal. A warning that the real end still waited just beyond the horizon. The farmhouse itself became an object of rumor. Local children dared each other to enter, claiming the walls still echoed with chanting. Travelers swore they saw strange lights there at night, though no one lived inside. Over time, the building rotted and fell, its timbers collapsing into the desert dust. But even in ruin, its story persisted, carried in whispers, in newspaper clippings, in fragments of memory told by those who could not quite let it go. Looking back now, one is left with questions that have no easy answers. Why did these people surrender their lives to a prophecy? Was it madness, manipulation, or simply the human need to believe in something larger than suffering? How fragile is the line between faith and delusion, between hope and destruction? These questions echo across history, for the story of Emmanuel's followers is not unique. Every generation finds its prophets, its promises of an end, and its believers willing to wait in darkness for a dawn that may never come. And perhaps that is the true terror of the tale. Not the storm that raged across the desert, not the chanting in the farmhouse, not even the silence of the failed apocalypse, but the reminder that despair can make prophets of anyone and followers of us all. The cult that waited for the end of the world may have dissolved into dust, but the yearning that gave it life still lingers, just beneath the surface, waiting for the next voice strong enough to call it forth. In the end, the apocalypse never arrived. The sun rose, the desert stretched on, and the world continued, indifferent to the cries of the faithful. Yet for those who lived it, something had ended. Their innocence, their certainty, their trust in divine deliverance, all were consumed in the silence of that night. And so the story remains, a caution whispered through time, that sometimes the end we fear most is not the collapse of the world around us, but the collapse of the world within.